So, yeah, good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everyone who's joined us. And I welcome you to this session. This is a pre-conference workshop for the AP-PPN conference, which is going to be held from March 4th to 5th, which is tomorrow and day after, and which is being hosted by the Department of Asian and Policy Studies at the Education University of Hong Kong. And typically every time the AP-PPN conference would happen, there would be a pre-conference workshop, which was targeted towards conference participants who are either PhD students or early career researchers. But this time, since the entire conference is being done remotely, we have the platform and the opportunity to open this workshop to others who are not part of the conference as well. And I really hope that this particular topic helps those who are students or early career researchers in navigating their way from converting their research into publications. And we had a session early in the morning, which was about the PhD journey and post-PhD employment. And I see a lot of people who were there for that session are here as well. And I really hope that these two sessions help add value to the things you know. Feel free to raise questions. And also do join us for the conference tomorrow and day after. In the mornings, we have some plenary sessions, which feature talks by invited speakers from universities in Hong Kong and outside of Hong Kong. And the afternoons are dedicated to panel sessions focused to different topics related to public policy, and all of that is on the website. And without further ado, I'm going to jump into today's session. So today's session is about converting research into publications. And the idea is to have a very frank roundtable sort of discussion with our group of panelists who have joined us from UK, Hong Kong, and Singapore. And thank you so much for giving us your time. We have with us, and I will introduce the panelists. So we have with us Dr. Junji Wee, who is a senior research fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies at the National University of Singapore. He has previously held assistant professorships at the Department of Asian and Policy Studies at the Education University of Hong Kong and at the Public Policy and Global Affairs program in Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Aside from these, he has also served as Rajwali Fellow at the John F. Kennedy School of Government in Harvard University and Post-doctoral Fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities in the Singapore University of Technology and Design. Dr. Wu received his PhD from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore, and his research interests include urban governance, policy design, and crisis management. In the course of his research, he has published 6 solo-authored books, 2 co-edited volumes, and 18 peer-reviewed journal articles. Thank you so much for joining us, JJ. Maybe I'll just go through the round of introductions and and then leave the floor open to the panelists. We also have with us Dr. Kris Hartley. Kris is an assistant professor in the Department of Asian and Policy Studies at the Education University of Hong Kong. He researches public policy and administration with a focus on environment and technology. Kris is also a non-resident fellow for global cities at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. He's a teaching fellow at the University of Melbourne Connected Cities Lab and an affiliated scholar at the Center for Government Competitiveness at Seoul National University. In 2019, he served as a visiting academic at the Institute of Policy Studies at the University of Brunei Darussalam. And in 2020, he was a Fulbright US scholar at the School of Public Policy at Chiang Mai University in Thailand. Kris has previously held academic appointments at Cornell University, University of Melbourne, Vietnam National University, and Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan. And during his doctoral studies, he was a visiting researcher at the University of Hong Kong and the University of the Philippines, Diliman. Kris's research and consulting projects are connected by the overarching theme of new public policy models for the 21st century. His 2014 and 2020 books address both with Routledge Press, address governance and policy models amidst global systemic disruptions. His research has been published in a variety of leading academic journals, including Policy Sciences, Policy in Society, Resources, Conservation and Recycling, Telematics and Informatics, Telecommunication, Policy, Geoforum, Journal of Economic Policy Reform, Environmental Development, and City, Culture and Society. Kris also serves as an associate editor at Policy in Society Journal and Policy Design and Practice Journal, as well as a policy briefs editor for the International Water Resources Association. He holds a PhD in public policy from the National University of Singapore and a Master's of City Planning from the University of California, Berkeley. Thank you so much, Kris, for joining us.
Thank you, Stuti. It's a pleasure to see everyone.
Thank you. We also have with us Dr. Masaru Yarime. Dr. Masaru is Associate Professor at the Division of Public Policy in the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. He also has appointments as Honorary Associate Professor at the Department of Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy in University College London and Visiting Associate Professor at the Graduate School of Public Policy in the University of Tokyo. His research interests center around science, technology, and innovation policy for energy, environment, and sustainability, particularly in exploring policy implications of data-driven innovation, including AI, Internet of Things, and smart cities. He received his Bachelor's in Engineering in Chemical Engineering from the University of Tokyo, Master's in Chemical Engineering from the California Institute of Technology, and PhD in Economics and Policy Studies of Innovation and Technological Change from the Maastricht University in the Netherlands. His previous appointments include Senior Research Fellow at the National Institute of Science and Technology Policy. Thank you so much, Masaru, for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you very much for a kind introduction.
And we also have with us Dr. Wei Yang. Dr. Wei is an associate professor in global health from King's College London. She's a health economist with an interest in health and long-term care financing policies. Wei has published widely in high-impact journals such as Social Science and Medicine, China Quarterly, European Journals of Health Economics, Health Policy, and Planning and Applied Economic Perspectives and Policy. She is a member of the editorial board of Global Health Research and Policy. Wei hosts the Future Research Leader Award of Economics and Social Research Council of the UK. Wei completed her PhD in Health Economics and Policy at the London School of Economics and Political Science, her MPhil in Medical Sociology at the National University of Singapore, and the BA in Sociology at Fudan University in China. Thank you so much, Wei, for being with us today.
Thank you, Stuti, for the introduction.
My pleasure. So one of the reasons we wanted to have this particular workshop was because as early career researchers, and I count myself as one of them, I've been struggling with trying to get my research published and also with just the whole process of integrating the way I research in a way that it also leads to publications. So the first question that I'm going to throw through the panel, and please feel free to answer. I mean, there's no order. Please feel free to pick up the question and just offer your thoughts in it. So the first question that I would throw to you is there any particular way, or what would you say is the way to integrate publishing into the way you research?
Maybe I can go first.
Yeah.
Yes, I think it's very important for you to actually start thinking about publication when you design a research project, and this is what I do. So I always thought about what kind of journal I want to publish, and also the eventual product of that research project even before I begin it. So I think it's quite important that you start to thinking about the publication before you design the research projects. And I think it's very critical that you will have to have a really innovative idea, especially if you want to publish in sort of high impact journals, like really good Zone 1 journals. then you will have to have a like really good research idea, which people haven't written about, or there's a huge research gap in the field, and you're trying to fill in. I think this is very important, and I think I don't know other people, but for me, I always try to find someone to work with on a research project or on a paper. I used to work alone quite a lot when I was doing my PhD, but as you become more sort of senior, you have more sort of teaching task and administrative task, you find it is almost impossible for you to complete a paper by yourself. I still do the single author paper, but it will take a long time for me to complete. So usually I will have a few co-authors within the research project as a team. Some of them, they are PhD students, some of them, they are postdocs. Some of them, they are, they sort of have the methodology expertise on that particular research project. And then you sort of start work with them. And then, these really help you to speed up the whole sort of publication process. And you will find that you will learn a lot, even if, you decide to work with a PhD students, and, this person may have some particular insights on these projects, or he's very strong in methods, and so on and so forth. So I think it's very good to have a team. So I would just say 2 points. So innovative research idea and find a team. So yes.
Thank you so much. I think that's also a question which we will address a little later as we proceed with the session. When we talk about having a team, then how do we choose who to collaborate with and who to avoid and things like that. We will come to that. But thank you for sharing those 2 points about having innovative ideas and making it a collaborative effort. GJ, would you like to add to that?
Sure. And well, I do agree with a lot of the things that Wei has talked about. And particularly important is that when you begin your research, you have to keep an eye on publishing. That is the end goal of your research. And so the way you frame your research, is it attractive to journals, attractive to the field? Is there a gap you're plugging? How do you frame a research question? And is this a topic that will gain citations in the first place? Is it something that people will be interested in citing? That requires a mix of some kind of theoretical innovation with empirical importance of the research. So these are all considerations that sort of come in. And certainly as you progress in your career, they will have to intersect with grant funders, who's giving you the money to do the research, and what kind of topics do they want to do. So in my mind, research is really about stakeholder management, managing journal editors, managing your grant providers, managing your colleagues, your collaborators. And as we have mentioned, I did spend a lot of time doing solo authored publications at the beginning. But one of the biggest advice I would give to PhD students is that to get to know your community really well, your professors, but more importantly, your classmates, your cohort mates, and get to try collaborating with your fellow PhD students, and especially within your cohort, because these people are going to progress in a career at a similar trajectory and speed as you are. And these people may well be having access to special issues, edited books, and you could all work together. And certainly Kris is somebody that I've been working with, and we have developed a relationship since our PhD days. And I continue to do that with former PhD classmates. So these are the 2 things I wanted to talk about.
Thanks so much, JJ. Masaru, Kris, would either of you like to add to that?
Masaru, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, well, I fully agree with what Wei and JJ said about the publication, the challenge. Probably I could mention that I have been working with many students and also many colleagues in different locations. So as I also mentioned that as you somehow getting senior, and you have a lot of different kinds of work to do. So to me, it's extremely important to work with my students and colleagues And so, yeah, today I see many names of my students and also my former students. So I'm very pleased to see their names here today. It's also now it's getting difficult to do everything by yourself because of the sophistication of methodologies and also different kinds of data you have to integrate. So it's very important to find the good collaborators and then to communicate well with the collaborators. And now we have all this kind of the telecommunication tools like Zoom and others. So it's now getting easier. So that's kind of communication and the collaboration is very important. And also probably I could mention that the conferences, I think conference presentation would be considered as a stepping stone, so that you normally set a deadline for presenting papers. So then you have to prepare something for that. Then that could be also a kind of important milestone in the sense that you, based on your presentation, then you can revise the paper and then going for publication. So I try to set that kind of deadlines. And also I try to organize some sessions for conferences. Last year, I organized a session at the conference held at the University College London. And then I actually invited my students to make presentations. And then now I'm organizing a special issue for a journal. Then that I really encouraging the students and younger researchers to contribute to these kind of special issues. So that's also something I'm now trying to do. So this year I'm going to organize several sessions in different conferences, and I'm also looking for opportunities to create some arenas for younger people to join, so that we can contribute to publishing papers.
Yeah, I think all the young research in this session have made note of that they will be on the lookout for these opportunities to join your sessions and contribute to your issues. Kris, if we may move on to you.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be involved here, and humbled to be on this panel with 3 other scholars who are so prolific in publishing, and hope I can just add a bit of insight. A lot of interesting stuff has already been said, but I would like to focus on one specific issue, and that is one that was particularly interesting while I was a student in terms of transitioning from a student to being, a post-PhD scholar or professor, is the idea that publishing and writing is intended for a specific audience, and keeping that in mind is important, because when we think about the journal that we might want to write for, we can always say that you can do or design a particular research project with the end goal in mind, which is to publish in a particular journal. So when we talk about how we research, we can think of that a number of different ways, either a particular methodology or a theoretical orientation, or even focusing on a case context, right? If I want to publish in Journal of Asian Public Policy, I might want to consider cases in the region. But at the same time, we think of these journals, at least when I did as a PhD student, as these just sort of big faceless organizations. And in fact, there are people and humans sitting behind these, and they're humans making decisions. There's an editor who's going to handle the submission, and then that editor is going to select a handful of reviewers. And keeping that in mind is sort of thinking about, who might I be writing for if I submit to this particular journal? So for example, when looking at, say, a journal and considering whether to submit, to look at the editorial board. There should be information easily available on the webpage. Those chief editors, maybe 3 or 4, for example, might be the people who are going to handle the submission. And then there may be a list of 15 or 20 sort of associate editors, or different journals call them different things, from whom the chief editors might select and you may consider, if you really have the time and the inclination, if you're really committed to that particular journal, but look through that list of 15 or 20 associate editors, many of whom, at least some of whom, would be selected probably to review a journal article, and look and see whose interests align with what you're doing. So, and see if you can speak to what they're doing. That's not necessarily a cynical approach or sort of gaming the system, but it's simply writing for an audience that you're anticipating writing for. And the more specific you can be about that audience and the more you can understand that audience, I think the better you can speak to them in a meaningful kind of way. So really, at the end of the day, I guess there are two approaches. And when I was a PhD student, my approach was I'm going to ask the question I want to ask, and I'm going to look at it in the way I want to look at it. And then I'm going to produce this work, this idea or this finding or this research, and I'm going to finish this paper. And then after it's all done, I'm going to survey the landscape of journals and see where it fits. So that's one approach. That's maybe kind of the purest approach. In the sense I'm going to do what I want to do and what I'm passionate about and what I feel I can add, and then I'm going to find a home for this work. Of course, the other approach is the pragmatist approach, which I just described, and that is, you know, if you don't want to go through 2 or 3 or 4 rounds of possible rejection in certain journals until you finally find a home, then you really start to focus specifically on audience. And it's not just, you know, what has this journal published in the past 2 to 5 years on my topic, or longer perhaps, what are the new debates that this journal seems to be interested in, but also the people sitting behind that journal. And that may help you decide, you know, I think so many papers are rejected early on because of just fit. You know, people think because it says public policy, and it says public policy and what they're doing, my article on public policy fits. Well, you know, at that level, there may be some type of misalignment. And as a PhD student, it's really hard to know. I was amazed by my professors who could say, well, this would fit in this journal, but not in this journal. Why? They all seem to look at policy or administration. Well, because these people are on the board of this journal and they have a particular theoretical orientation, or they have a particular agenda for the development of their journal. This is impossible to know. And some of this stuff is not necessarily articulated in a journal description. It's just knowing the people and knowing what they're interested in, what they're doing. And that can only come with just spending longer time in the community and talking with people. So you eventually get to the point where you start to get the lay of the landscape. Journals aren't these, you know, these huge institutions. They're collections of people with particular interests, and knowing that'll really help you target your work.
Thanks so much, Kris. I think a related question stemming from that would be, so what advice would you have for someone who's dealing with a steady stream of rejection? So of course, one, as you suggested, would be to view it as just being an inappropriate fit for the journal it's been sent to, but what next, right?
I think all of us have some rejections, and these days publishing is a very difficult thing. One of my advice is, if you submit a paper to a journal and you get rejected, if you have gone, you have gone through one round of revision and you got some comments, I always revise my paper before I submit to another journal. I would never submit a rejected paper immediately to another journal which of a lower grade. I think it's quite important for you to understand, because some of the issues one journal editor or reviewer they have picked up will be picked up by another editor or a few other reviewers. So if you submit a rejected paper to another journal directly, you probably will get the same problem. Yeah. So fix the problem first, I think, before you go before you submit to another journal. Another thing is you really need to pay attention to the particular comments, exactly why they reject your paper. It could be your paper is not a very good fit to the journal. It could be there's some methodological problems or not enough empirical contribution and so on and so forth. But sometimes, especially, I mean, for many of us, English is not our first language. The writing could be a very big problem. Even nowadays, when I review journal papers or when I review papers for my students, if this is a paper written by non-native speakers, I can see lots of mistakes, not just because they don't, sometimes it's grammar mistakes, sometimes it's just about how to write it very clear, to express your idea in really clear, concise way. I think this is very important. So I would suggest, if you're not a native speaker, and sometimes if you're not very confident with your English, perhaps you could get a copy editor to do a round of copy editing before you submit it to a journal. Yeah, I think this is very important as well, especially for non-native speakers.
Yeah, and I do agree with so much of what you said, and based on my experience, rejection is part and parcel of the job. It happens at every stage of the publication process. Could be a desk reject, and in that case, you know that it's not a good fit, and you could get comments from the desk editor, or you could go through a first round of review and come back with a lot of comments. And the most important advice is not to be disheartened, obviously. I mean, we all have to deal with this at the latest slide and to look at these comments objectively. We all know about reviewer 2. We all know about the nasty comments that we can get, and you can really get a young scholar down. And the key thing is to just look at it objectively, think about how you can improve a paper, reframe it, look at another journal you can go for. At a very pragmatic level, you may want to work your way down the list if it's not working out at the top journals. I mean, the second tier publication is better than no publication. So in that way, there is a pragmatic aspect to it as well. So that is important, an important thing to take note of, that rejection is something we have to deal with emotionally as much as practically.
Masaru, would you like to add?
Yes. Yeah, I think as Kris mentioned, that the fit between your paper and also the journal would be, I think very important. So so in that sense, that you need to understand the preferences of journals, and if you look at the papers published first in that journal, then you can see some kind of tendencies. And also, if you look at the editorial board members, and then you can see some of their works, and then probably you can see some what kind of the papers they favor to publish in that paper, in that journal. So that would be, I think, very important. Yeah, then, well, yeah, if you receive rejection letter, that would be damaging. So I just leave it for a few days, and then just try to forget about it, and then try to think about where to submit next, because it's so, even now it's still quite damaging even at this age. So I can imagine that if you're young, then it's really a problem. But that's part of the game. So somehow you have to go through. Yeah, well, and also, yeah, I think the look at the comments and suggestions, that's always useful, and try to, generally speaking, I think it's good to just listen to the comments and suggestions. And yeah, sometimes the comments might be quite difficult to respond, or sometimes quite unreasonable, in the sense that the reviewer may not necessarily read the paper carefully. But to argue against the suggestion would be also a tough challenge in replying to their comments. So generally speaking, I try to just follow their advice and suggestion, then try to somehow deal with their comments. So that's the way you try to deal with these comments.
Thank you, Masaru. Kris, would you like to add to that?
Oh, sure. Yeah, good comments by everybody, and I fully agree. Just a couple of points here. First, again, getting back to this underlying theme that our field and the way it operates, whether it's publishing or whether it's jobs or whether it's anything else, it's a people business like anything else. It's about connections. It's about people who know each other and networks. And the way I bring that into the publishing side is just a very brief story. A colleague whom some of you may know, Julian Kircher, who was at the Lee Kuan Yew School for a while, wanted to bring me in on some circular economy research. So we did some work. we decided to present that. I decided to present it at a conference, and I think it was at the ICPP conference, perhaps in Montreal a couple of years ago. There was this small group of scholars working on this particular issue, which was circular economy policies, policies to promote circular economy. And present in that seminar were the editors of a particular journal that was really interested in advancing the circular economy discussion. And they took an interest in the work by asking some questions, and then I caught up with them after the seminar and just talked with them about the new special issue they were doing, et cetera. And when we talk about getting past that first cut, that desk reject, and into the hands of reviewers, that first cut is often a very high bar. And if you have established a communication with those editors, if they anticipate that they're going to receive a submission from you, they recognize your name, they know who you are, and they know you're speaking directly to a topic they're interested in, that's going to substantially increase their chances, and you're going to have somebody in your corner already. And so this works at conferences. It can also work not just presenting at conferences, but going to a conference and simply sitting in on a session, even if you're not presenting, but sitting in on a session that has something to do with the paper you're writing, and getting, once again, a lay of the kind of the social landscape of that field, the sub, sort of the sub network or the subgroup of people who work on that, who is really seems to be leading in that field, and who are trying to push for publications in that field. And I mean, that's kind of the guerrilla tactics of getting published in a certain way. It's approaching it through kind of the more personal level. The other suggestions, such as reframing, is very important, I think. Reframing for a particular journal. It's sort of like a cover letter when you apply to many positions, right? You are who you are. You're not going to change that, but you can change how you frame who you are to fit with a certain position. So if you're going to reframe a paper, it doesn't mean you're going to rerun all the regressions or go back to the field and do more interviews or whatever else. But it could mean that in the abstract and the introduction and the conclusion, you're sort of bending it around and orienting it towards some conversation that journal is having, including, and I hope I don't sound too sort of utilitarian here or kind of too pragmatic, but you can look at work literally written by editors of that journal and maybe cite that work. So you could say, well, as X person has said in an important discussion about this issue, I am building upon this thing. So again, that really, it signals to editors and to reviewers that you are not just writing about what they're talking about, but that you're joining their community. You're signaling you're joining their community, you're joining their discussions, and thus you're invested in it just a little bit. You don't have to compromise who you are or compromise what your research is by doing that. It's just a matter of identifying the relevance of that work to a certain group of people. The issue about going down the list, as JJ said, I think we all have to come to terms with that. We're not going to all get everything in a JPART or PAR or anything else. So going down the list at a Q2, you can go to Simago website and identify. Sometimes you just may have to do that, or even a chapter, or look around which people are putting together an edited volume, et cetera. Getting in on a special issue is another way to at least get your paper a reading, at least in some ways get it a review. And then finally, just very briefly, is co-author. At the end of the day, if you think that somebody, you've said, well, help me identify what I can do with this paper, and that person's very helpful, that's one thing. But maybe you say, well, that person really brings a unique theoretical perspective, or that person can take another look at the data and draw some other inferences out of that. Well, offer that person can you just come on as a second co-author and then help me more deeply look at some of this. And I don't think that's disingenuous at all, and I think it happens quite often, and that may be a last resort, but certainly doesn't mean your paper has to die with just you as a sole author.
Thanks so much, Kris. Yeah, I mean, I think that also, the point about co-authoring, I guess, also sort of ties in with the advice that we've heard from and from Masaru and even from JJ about working towards publications as a collaborative exercise. And on that note, the question that I would want to pose to the panel is that how would you decide who to collaborate with? And are there any traits that you would choose to avoid if you see them in a collaborator?
I think one of the most important thing about collaboration is that your work style, your pace of work and writing somewhat has to gel even a little bit, because it gets tough when you work with somebody who's not on, working in the same style or on the same page as you. So that very pragmatically is important. And for me, the first few people I chose to work with were obviously my professors. They knew my thesis, they knew my work, and it was a way for me to sort of learn the ropes. The way I learned how to write a journal article was that I wrote one with one of my thesis advisors, and watching how he worked on the paper and sent me revisions, how he mercilessly deleted my sentences and rejigged a lot of my writing, I sort of learned the language that particular journal was looking for. So that helped a lot. So certainly at the early stages, look for somebody who is a little bit more senior than you, who could teach you a little bit about writing the style, doing the correct research. And certainly, as I've mentioned, working with your PhD cohort mates or classmates. So those are important. And with regards to avoiding, it's really difficult. Oftentimes, by the time you realize that this is someone you should not be working with, you are already working with that person. And I'm talking about free riders. We know the sort who would do a little bit of work and hope that you pull the rest of the paper through. And then there are those professors who would ask you to do a lot of writing, and then they are first author. These things are common in academia. So in a way, you should take that as a learning experience as well. And going forward, you know that this is somebody you may not want to work with, unless it's something really interesting. You're willing to put more effort into it. Yeah.
Thanks so much, AJ. That is an important point about taking these bad experiences as a learning experience, and yeah, just using that to know who to avoid in the future. But you also mentioned, so collaborating with someone, especially if it's somebody senior to you, can help you learn the craft. I think something which a lot of PhD students also struggle with is, how would you go about it? So typically, did you approach your professor and say, would you like to co-author with me? Or it's something that tends to happen organically?
Well, I had to approach my professor. So there will be professors who come and ask you to be part of their project. But I had a paper in mind, and I knew that my professor had a particular framework and approach that he was working on. So I approached him directly and asked him, would you be able to co-author a piece with me? And yeah, typically in a relationship like that, you expect to do a little bit more of the groundwork.
Mm-hmm.
You do learn a lot in the process.
That's true. That's true. What about you, Wei?
I think I really agree with what JJ said. You need to find someone who is experienced in the field to work with, especially if this is one of your first paper. Then you definitely need someone who know the language and who know the journal and who know the field really well to work with you. And one thing I wouldn't particularly do is I wouldn't always go for the big names. I had experience before. Just like what JJ said, sometimes people have really big name in the field, but they don't really contribute to the paper. And as a PhD student, if you are really, junior in the field and you haven't really published a lot, the person that you really want to work with is someone who have the time, who have the patience, and who will dedicate, his or her time to help you to revise the paper. This is really substantial work. I was really lucky when I was doing my PhD. I had a chance to work with someone actually also from Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and I was doing my exchange PhD, program there, and I was working with Professor Xing Wu. I don't know if some of you know him. I really learned a lot from the whole process, and he's really patient and really dedicated. Almost every paragraph I wrote, he made some change, and you sort of start to have a feel how you should write a journal article. and what essentially each section need to include, how to write a critical literature review, how to write the message clearly, how to organize your results, and so on and so forth. I really learned a lot from the whole process. I think you don't really need someone to just roughly read it and then give you some rough comments, which doesn't really help you that much. You need someone to really sit down with you, at least for the first 1 or 2 paper that you of your PhD. You need someone to sit down with you to go through the paragraphs and even the sentences in details, and help you to understand the whole process of writing a paper. So I think find someone who's experienced in the field and who has the time is really important. Yeah.
Sorry, if I can just add to that, you'd also mentioned early on that now you tend to collaborate a lot more with your students, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you are looking at which PhD students you would want to collaborate with, are there any qualities that you consider particularly appealing?
I think I like to work with PhD students who are really efficient and productive. I think all of us want to have the same sort of goal when we hire or when we want to recruit a PhD student. So yeah, so my PhD student, when she came here for the PhD program, we had, I think, 5-6 rounds of revision of a proposal until I said, okay, I'm happy to take her in. And she's actually here, I can see her name. Is this really show that he's really hardworking, he's dedicated to the research, and he really want to do this PhD. And this is very important. One thing I would avoid is who just want to get a degree and then get a position after that. I do want to work with really ambitious students who want to make some achievements in the field. We want to pursue really ambitious topic. I think it's really important. So find a really productive, hardworking PhD student is one of the most important criteria for me.
Thank you. And that's also so interesting, because that means that even if a student's not quite there, as long as they're willing to put in the hard work
Yes.
to get to a place where their writing skills or research skills have improved, you would be willing to collaborate with them as long as
yes. Yeah.
I think that would, very heartening advice for those who are here. Masaru, if I may ask you, when you decide to collaborate, are there any things you're looking out for?
Yeah, well, yes, I think in the past that I've never counted the number of my courses, but I think there are more than 50
Oh, wow.
authors. So I actually did extensively collaboration with many the researchers in different universities in different countries. I think obviously it's important to have to share some the common interest in a particular area or particular methodology. But at the same time, also you try to get people involved with something you don't have, some expertise in, I don't know, for example, the statistical analysis or some particular knowledge in a particular domain. That would be ideally complementary with you and also other collaborators. So, and again, that increasingly we need to integrate the different kinds of expertise in writing papers. So I think that the collaboration is also one way of getting something you don't have by yourself. And also, I think this also depends upon which communities you're going to enter, in the sense that, particularly in the case of public policy, where we have a general framework of public policy, but then that some of them are very interested in political process and public administration or policy science as a kind of general framework. But others are more interested in specific policies like environmental policy, innovation policy, health policy. So then that, to me, that the public policy community have different kinds of group within this the whole framework. So I guess that also influenced the choice of your journals, which means that which communities you're going to somehow reside, in the sense that you're going to belong to in the future. So then probably you might think about picking up some researchers who are active in that particular domain which you're interested in, so that well, as Ray mentioned, that I think it's not necessarily a good idea to pick up big names, well, because obviously they are very busy and also they may not be able to contribute to your paper. But somebody who would be active, relatively maybe younger researchers, quite getting productive and visible in that community, then maybe it's good to work with that kind of person, because you can learn also from that person, and also you can get the momentum pushing you to work hard. So that would be also, I think, one way of finding collaborators.
A question that I have, which is sort of related to it, is that as early career researchers, what would you advise, whether so in terms of, like, if suppose you have an article which you need to send out to a journal, is it better to send it out to a more general journal, or is it better to target it towards a more specific, narrower community within the broader field, or it's just context specific?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and also very important. To be honest, I'm also struggling with that question all the time. In a way that I think, at least in my case, my many publications were published in more specific journals like energy policy or sustainability science, and the renewable and sustainable energy reviews, and these kind of more specific policy domains, rather than policy science or public administration review, or these kind of more general. So that really depends on your interest and also your future career development. So I think that really depends on the context and your specific environment. Yeah.
Kris, could I ask you to offer your thoughts on that, if you have any? Thank you, Masaru. Kris, you're muted.
Yes, absolutely. So it's a very interesting phenomenon, this collaboration, because I think that when we're at our early stage, we're working, we want to reach up and collaborate with people who have experience. But some of the things I've done have been with my colleagues and peers and even friends. And I think that underscores the trust element that, you know, first and foremost, we want to work with people that we trust. And because, you know, that reflects itself in how much they're willing to commit to the project and follow through, et cetera. So a lot of that just comes from, I mean, I think I have most of my co-authors I have known either through networks, through having gone to school with them, et cetera. And also when there's that trust and that, you know, there's a bit more sort of commitment and willingness that each party's not going to let the other party down. So I've often found that does end up producing something quite productive. If you're reaching above and you want to target somebody to work with, and whether it's a professor or somebody else in your department who's a senior professor or somebody you met at a conference, I think that as a junior colleague, you would want to articulate what you bring to that person. And I hate to, again, be so sort of brutally practical or pragmatic about it, but you know, they have a decision whether to work for you. And if they see something in you, they don't necessarily know you, there's not a personal connection. They're going to want to understand what you bring to the collaboration. So demonstrating what you offer to them. So much research and even writing up is an exercise in division of labor. So are you the methods person? Are you the person's coming with data? Are you the person that has access to some people to interview? Are you the person who has good familiarity with a particular type of theory that you can arrange? So I've had people approach me, and I have approached others with these types of conversations. You know, so what can I do to help this paper? You know, can we look at what you have and orient it towards a particular theoretical audience, for example? So again, that's just looking at kind of the practical way of how research unfolds and identifying where your role is in that. Also, in terms of just being strategic, I mean, a lot of people are opportunistic. I've been myself. An opportunity comes, I'll jump in and do it. But at the same time, I've found that when I look at people to collaborate with, I want those collaborations to continue. If you work well with somebody the first time, you want that to continue. And it's not just because you already have somebody you trust and you already have somebody with a history, but it's also because you have that conversation going with somebody and you can dig deeper into those conversations that you have between each other. I have a colleague, Glenn, in the United States, who've been working on the role of policy and knowledge, or the role of power and knowledge in the policy process. And we've just been batting ideas back and forth now for years that lead us to different ideas for publications. Things come up in the real world, you know, a policy or a pandemic or something else, and we're immediately on email saying, wow, this sounds a lot like what we discussed. We should totally put something together and send this out. And now we've got a list far too long than we can ever even get to, but it just creates this kind of close relationship. So longer term collaborative strategy, I think, is really useful. Finally, I'll say very briefly, as you move up in your careers, even early on, you're going to find yourself being the one that other people come to. I've been, and I'm sure many of us on this panel, all of us on this panel have had that experience, and I'm just starting to get that experience where occasionally somebody will say, well, can I author with you? And typically my first reaction is, okay, where is this person positioned within my field? Do they know and work with anybody else in my field, or are they from engineering, or are they from somewhere else? And I'm going to have to work very hard to try to understand what they do, and I'm going to have to get them up to speed on what I'm doing and what our community is doing. So, you know, the first thing is it is still a people business and very much a network style business. But I would say, in closing, be generous in some ways as well. Sometimes you know, if I would see somebody who's maybe even still a PhD student say, well, I got this interesting idea and I'm interested in working with you. And if they check out on the trust aspect, on the network aspect, on the alignment aspect, you know, even though it may be technically more wise for me to collaborate with some high level scholar, I want to be generous and work with people because they are going to be good eventually as well, right? They will not always be junior scholars. And the cohort that we all are is relatively young group of researchers. We're going to move up, you know, the profession over the years and over the decades. And some people will fall off and other people will come in, but there's a very good chance that somebody who's asking you to collaborate is going to be in the field for, you know, years and maybe even decades. And wouldn't it be nice to say, you know, to have that person say, wow, I reached out to Kris, you know, when I was a PhD student 30 years ago, and we co-authored something really neat, and it really developed some ideas, and I built on those in my career. These are the people you're with. And so always, I think, be generous about helping them cultivate their own careers. Because we're all going to be equals down the road, right? We're all going to be senior level professors working on these things, and it's no time like the present to establish those working relationships.
Thank you, Kris. That's also a very positive note to everyone who's here. I'm just going to look at the chat window in case we have any questions so far. We have an exclamation about someone agreeing with something that was said, but no questions yet. So I will move to the next question. So far we've discussed about collaborations. We've also discussed about integrating research into, integrating publishing into the way that we conduct research. But if we were to take a few steps back and go to view it from the eyes of a PhD students that's really even just struggling to get started. So would you have any tips for PhD candidates on how to get started with just the process of writing a research piece for a journal article, maybe drawing backward to your own experiences?
I would say that writing and research, they are two distinct skill sets, and both need to be honed. Both of them are different sets of crafts. And one of the ways that as a PhD student that I started on this was I started small. I started with working papers, research reports, and commentary pieces, whatever it takes to start the writing process, to hone that ability to present your research findings in a way that is succinct, punchy, speaks to whatever audience you're writing for, and then you build from there. You get more confident as you get more things out. It could just be a working paper within your department or in a think tank somewhere, and I found that most helpful.
Thanks so much, JJ. If I may ask you, would you have any tips for PhD candidates on how to get started?
Yeah, I think I really agree with JJ. Yeah, so start with something small. Maybe, perspective paper or working paper, even sometimes just present your research idea in front of your research group. We think our department in King's, we have this PhD group, which we call it GROW. So they do organize this writing group, and they meet every month, the PhD students and the early career researchers, and they discuss a working paper or a piece of writing. Each other will read this piece and give comments. I think that you do really learn a lot from this kind of exercise. The more you write, the more you will feel more confident, and you start to know, the whole process, and so I would say it's more practice, yeah. And then also it's very good to do some presentations when you have sometimes when you have the first set of results of a paper in front of the academic staff in the department, or in a conference, to get some comments. It's very important because sometimes when you're working too long on a project, especially for a PhD student, you haven't really got lots of comments from people other than your PhD advisor. It's really good for you to present your research to a bigger audience and to get some insights from other people, and that will really benefit your paper writing in a later stage.
Thank you so much, Ree. In fact, somebody posted in the chat window, and I think that's related to what you just said about presenting your ideas perhaps at a conference. And it's something which Masaru also mentioned, that conferences can be a good way to nudge you towards writing and towards completing your research article. But the question that we have from the audience is, with respect to doing presentations and attending conferences, are there any ways in which you can improve how you're communicating about your research?
I think it's really about practice and practice and practice. So if you are going to do a conference presentation, what I usually do, I'll try to rehearse a few times of my presentation results before I actually go on the stage to speak to a bigger audience. I would advise the same thing for the PhD students as well, and especially if English is not your first language. So this is very important, and also know your topic is very important as well. So you need to really understand, be able to sort of articulate your research question, be able to tell people the motivations or rationale behind this research question, why you want to use a particular methods, how the analysis is done, even the really detailed things, because I'm a health economist by training. So sometimes when you go to conference, people ask you really technical questions and really into the details. You need to be prepared to answer these questions. And also I think sometimes it's very important also to relate your paper to the policy context, especially most of my paper, quantitative paper, they can be really specific and really technical. And how do we relate those very sort of quantitative results to a bigger context, and how these results will have any policy implications or influence the policy process. And I think it is very important for you to also include these at the end of the presentation in a conference as well. So yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm also just going to, we had another question that came up in the chat, and this is open to all the panelists, whoever wants to answer it, that Victoria wants to know that she's very interested in hearing about how to literally convert her research into a publication, because she's identified a gap in the literature and she has an idea of what she wants to study, but she just doesn't know how to come up with a research question and how to proceed from there. Would any of the panelists like to answer Victoria's question?
I'll just jump in and start talking off the top of my head. I mean, it's a really broad question. I think identifying a gap in the literature, having a good idea of what I want to study should be pointing you already towards some type of research question. If you've looked at what people have said about a particular topic, then you know, you should have a pretty good idea what needs to be answered. But also, I'm a big fan of taking, once again, a pragmatist approach to this. Can you match up what you are able to accomplish as a researcher with what that research question is or what that gap is? Do you have the funds to be able to go out into the field and start doing interviews? Do you have connections to be able to get the right kinds of interviews? Do you have the funds to buy a data set, or do you have the funds to be able to put together a survey and pay a firm to administer that survey, or do it yourself? These types of things. So again, the type of research that we do doesn't just emerge in sort of this pure form in a vacuum. It's determined by all sorts of practical constraints and realities. I would think also in terms of the right research to question you're asking, the literature that you've looked at, you should be able to look at that and ask not just what they're asking, but what types of questions they're asking. Are they asking how questions or why questions? Are they process tracing? Are they looking at, you know, is it purely some type of econometric analysis? Are they just looking for associations between variables, et cetera? You know, because the type or kind of research question you're asking, which you, I would assume, have discussed somewhat in your graduate research seminars, will make a big difference. But I'm a big fan of the idea of trying to publish before getting out of school, just to expand the argument a little bit. I think that, and we could go into the job market as well and how that intersects with publication, but you really need something on the books before you leave. You need to have some kind of publication out. And when you're a student, you've been in the first couple of years in classes and PhD seminars, you go with the material you have. Be strategic about the types of papers you write in order to get the grade. You don't just leave those behind. Aditi said in the earlier session, never let a written word go wasted. Well, be strategic about how, you know, the things that you're writing is not just to get a grade. That is, these are valuable words you've written. Look at trying to turn those into something that you can research. And you know, you can start to get maybe an easy run on the board by doing maybe a more conceptual paper, by doing a literature review, by doing some type of theoretical argument. You know, those are a little bit more difficult to publish, but if your literature review is done very systematically and even using some new types of tools that are out there to do real high quality comprehensive reviews. There was one review that won a young researcher an award just in the past couple of days that I saw on Twitter for in our field. So you can do that, you can get something on the board, and then you can build from that. But in general, you know, aside from that, just let your publication motivation be known to your professors, not just your immediate advisors, but the people who taught you something, the people who were your teachers. You know, go back to them and use their role as your teacher as an excuse to say, hey, listen, you owe it to me to talk to me a little bit about how I might advance my research. And I think many of them would be very glad to do that. A PhD professor shouldn't just be, well, I gave the grade and I walk away.
Mm-hmm.
You know, these are people that PhD professor, might actually be working with in the long run. You know, and you, by virtue of being a PhD student, are already in some ways part of the academic community. So go to people even that you only took classes with, but may not be on your panel or your committee, and let your interest be known. I'm just interested in researching. I've got this broad idea, but I want to look. And I think you'll find, at least in my program, people are very willing to help, regardless of the culture of the school, et cetera. It still comes down to, you know, people's relationship with each other. A professor can look into your eyes, can hear what you're saying, and think, wow, I remember what it's like to be a PhD student who was really looking and very hungry to get published. And I think most of them respond positively to that and try to point you in the right direction. And you know, you might need to talk to a few to get the right kind of idea that'll perfectly line up. But ultimately, make use of those. You have a built-in network already in your department, so lean on that.
I couldn't agree with you more, Kris. I think it's those conversations that you have, whether it's with the professors who taught you or other professors in your department, that can really help you. Even if it's just a very tentative idea, it can help you view it from a lens. It can help you see it from the lens of someone who is a lot more experienced and who can immediately see where there are, you know, where there are gaps and what are the limitations, things which might not be obvious to you, but which to an experienced person are obvious, you know, right from the moment you first put forth the idea. Thank you so much for that answer. And we have another question from another one of the audience members. And Yalu asked that when is it appropriate to seek for help in terms of, okay, so we usually seek for help and advice on research ideas and manuscripts, but once you've graduated from the doctoral program, when would it be appropriate to seek for help? Only after I have a completed manuscript, or can you reach out to people earlier?
I don't think there's anything stopping you from reaching out, to somebody for advice even early on in the research. And sometimes the advice you get early on in the manuscript, before you prepare a complete manuscript, could be valuable. It could be chasing down a blind alley and you wouldn't know it. So I think it's good to seek advice as and when you feel like you need it. The first person I usually go to, as Kris would have mentioned, is back to my PhD professor, my community in the PhD program, but also at your workplace, wherever you happen to be working at. So I remember that as a postdoc, I had an excuse to go around asking for advice from all the professors in the department. Because I was only a postdoc, I was only one step up from a PhD student. I was still learning. I have a lot to learn. So people generally are quite generous to give to you at that stage. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And again, it ties in with the importance of having a wider network so that you have different people who are working on different topics. So depending on what you're working on or what you're struggling with, you can approach these different people. So it's not always relying on the same person, but instead staggering it out over different individuals. Masaru, would you like to add something?
Yeah, well, yes, obviously it's good to talk with the people who are around you. Also, I think, as I mentioned before, I think the presentations in your conference would be a good way of getting suggestions, question, and particularly, I'd say mid-range conference in a way that you can see first. Well, you can see a very big conference, like hundreds of people, 1,000 people come. That's one way of looking at overall trends in a particular, let's say, public policy. But then you can also see a very small scale workshop with only 5 people or maybe 10. And then there's something somewhere between mid-range, in a way, let's say 30 to 50 people in a particular topic. Then you tend to have a very detailed discussion with experts who are really working on that area. So then normally presentation will be longer than the big conference. Maybe you have a discussant assigned to your presentation. Then probably you can see in the audience the potential reviewer of your paper. So then you can get very good comments and questions you would expect when you submit a paper to a journal. And some of the audience might be actually your reviewer later. I think you could use that kind of opportunity and then try to present your findings, and then you can really get very specific comments and suggestions. I sometimes feel that that would be a really good opportunity to get kind of suggestions. And yeah, then somehow when I attended that kind of the meetings, and then I was also actually assigned a reviewer for that paper later in a journal. You could really see. So somehow, if you later you come to somehow define your area, and then you get to know people there, and then also now you have opportunities to review papers written by people you know, actually. Or you can guess sometimes. In the case of double-blind system, you can really see who is actually the author of the paper. So then that you could really get a kind of connect somehow the feeling of belonging to a particular community. And then you also get some recognitions in that community. And then you can also get more feedback and suggestions, advice later.
And in fact, that brings me to a very relevant question. And since all of you who are on today's panel are prolific writers and have many publications around and are also either journal editors or have served as reviewers for many journals. On that note, the question that I'd want to ask is, so in your role as reviewers or editors, are there any things that you would consider to be deal breakers, or are there any tips that you would have as someone who reviews another person's article, or as a journal editor?
Well, I'll jump in quickly. I'm a pretty simple person. I think that things like mistakes, awkward phrasing, and grammar, I don't mean to focus unduly on that, but I think fairly or unfairly, it signals I won't say sloppiness, because that's not necessarily a polite way to put it, but just, a paper that's just not been polished in a way. And that if that's a problem just in terms of readability, then I wonder about the follow through on the fundamentals of the paper, on things like the execution of the research itself. I mean, I think one of a good tenet to live by is, don't give the editor any reason. Even if the editor is unreasonable and says, well, the first misspelling I see, then the paper's gone. Okay, well, I try to be pretty understanding, especially when I review a paper, that I'll just say, okay, I'm going to assume they're going to clean up that side of it. But in general, just start off by not giving anybody any reason, even if it's a simple reason like that. Things like formatting, my goodness, I've seen just different fonts and weird margins. I mean, it sounds so petty and so simple, and yet these are just really, some of these things are easy things that can be done with just an hour extra of just looking through the paper. As we've mentioned before, maybe sending it to somebody else to look through, etc. So those are just some of the first cut issues, of course. But I think also, just in terms of being a reviewer and also an editor, there needs to be an indication very early on that the author understands what the journal is about and is understanding the audience of the journal. Will the people reading the journal feel like that author speaking to them and the issues that they're interested in and concerned about? And a lot of this has to do with even just simply the use of terminology, for better or for worse. And it's maybe it's not fair, but the use even of a single term can signal something. It signals, in using the right terms in the right context, can signal that you are connected to the debates that are being had in that particular subfield and in that journal. And if I'm having to wonder what they mean by this phrase or that phrase, and think, well, I guess it probably has something to do with collaborative governance or technocracy or something, these things shouldn't be a matter of guesswork. It should be fairly obvious. So I think those are really important, and to say the least, obviously, strong fundamentals in the methodology and strong connection with if the journal is asking for practical implications, put practical implications in. If you believe the journal, or if the journal holds itself forward as being practice oriented, make sure that comes across in the abstract, and then again in the first paragraph of the introduction, and then again in the first paragraph and last paragraph, the conclusion. Make it very obvious so you understand what that journal is about. And I speak specifically about policy design and practice, PDP, where I've reviewed a number of articles in the past year and have put together a couple of special issues. I think people will just take articles that were rejected by other journals and they just ship it straight on off to PDP, thinking, well, PDP is not a listed journal, it's fairly new. They'd probably be happy to take my brilliant article. Well, again, there is a particular mission for policy design and practice, and it is to try to bridge design, policy design, and as an academic field, and the practice of it as well. So there needs to be signaling that you understand it, and it needs to happen soon, like first 2 or 3 sentences is best. Otherwise, people are busy, they've got a lot of submissions to manage. The first thing they see that looks a little bit askew, they'll be like, yeah, I've got 50 other submissions waiting, maybe not, depending on the journal. And, and one of those is likely to be a little bit more targeted to the journal. So don't give anybody a reason to put it in the garbage can.
Thanks, Kris. That's really good advice. Would any of the other panelists like to add something?
I guess the general fit of the article and things like the title, the abstract. So these are obviously the first thing that a reviewer or a desk editor will look at. And if it gives the impression that this article doesn't quite understand what this journal is about, I think it's far too easy for an editor to reject it at that stage.
Yeah, just following what JJ said, I think that the fit between your paper and also journal will be, I think, very important. I think you often cite papers from a particular journal for your literature review or some other dimensions. And then that obviously that suggests that your paper would probably fit well for that journal. And I also served as a member of the editorial board for sustainability science. And then if you look at the paper, and then if you look at the list of the references, and then if you find many papers from that particular journal, then you can see that probably the author of this paper will be familiar with what has been discussed in that particular journal. Then probably it's easier for editor to also assign the reviewers. And that increasingly it's getting difficult to convince the researchers to take the role of reviewers because people are so busy. And then I actually received so many rejection replies from potential reviewers. So in that case, I often ask the authors of the papers cited in that paper so that I would expect that these authors will be potentially willing to take the role of reviewing that paper. So that would be one thing which somehow facilitate the process of reviewing. Although it's not really the purpose of increasing the citation to increase the impact factor. So that's not something really you should do in the sense that it's not so much about manipulating the kind of impact factors, so that I think I heard that some journals try to really tell the authors to cite the papers from that particular journal to increase the number of citations. That's very questionable behavior. So, but just to show that you're familiar with the discussion in the journal, then I think it's easier to see that the paper is really following the previous discussion in a particular journal. So that would make it easier for assigning reviewers.
Thank you, Masaru. I think that's a tip I'm going to incorporate as well in the next article that I send out. we have a number of questions from the audience. So I'm going to jump to the next one, which is from Vishnu. And Vishnu says, we tend to read the past year's papers to understand the trend of journal articles, the research domain that a journal article adheres to. However, after the COVID, and because COVID was such a shock, do you think that will change the priorities or discussions of a journal article? So I think the question, and this is, I guess, a broader question to the panel, whether because of COVID, you anticipate there being a change in the priorities of what journals prefer to publish.
Well, I'll start. I think a lot of us have been motivated to jump right in terms of writing about COVID and looking at COVID. And at the very, very initial stages of the crisis, it appeared to be appropriate just to stay in our own lanes, theoretically, methodologically, and with our policy domain. So let the public health experts handle that. But of course, it was very clear very soon that this wasn't just a public health issue, but it was going to be governance, economic, social, political. It just rules every aspect of society at this stage. So I think that all journals, I believe, are open, at least if policy related, or open to articles that have case studies pertaining to the pandemic and peripheral policy issues around that. And I think I would use this question as an opportunity to make a broader point as well. And this is based on something I heard from one of our professors. JJ will know, Ed, good old Professor Ed at Lee Kuan Yew School. We all had him for institutions. And Ed said something very briefly in class that stuck with me one time. He said, you know, approach your career in a way that you're kind of a methodologist, and you have a method and you will travel. And then you can adjust. And we even see this in individual people's careers. Some people start off looking at some case context and they move to another case context and another case context. So I would say that in crafting your identity as a researcher, that is probably one fairly good option to be the methodology, whether you're in Q methodology or whether you're particularly good at econometrics or some subset of econometrics, et cetera, that you can approach any sort of case context, and if you've got the right kind of data, you can use your methodology to provide some unique insights. Same thing with perhaps a theoretical orientation as well. If you have a particular theoretical orientation, such as kind of a critical perspective or something like that, you can look at a variety of different issues and lend this kind of critical theoretical perspective on you know, power dynamics and marginalization, et cetera, which shows up in so many ways. And is showing up again in COVID. So how I bring this back around to COVID is that if you are a scholar with that kind of flexibility, you have a transportable methodological orientation, or you have a transportable theoretical orientation, the beauty of that is that across your career, you're able to move in and out of different types of case contexts, environment, social policy, pandemics. As things come up, you can reorient yourself. Whereas if you have defined yourself as, you know, purely a public health expert, or purely a maybe, I don't know, environmental policy expert or something like that, and that's fine, and you can have a very productive career with that. But you know, when something like COVID comes up, you might have to stretch to find some way to be part of that conversation. So with that said, I think that you know, just to answer this question, journals are happy to take, in my experience, I don't know why any journal would be unhappy to take articles about COVID. I don't think it's going to fundamentally reorient what most journals consider themselves to be. You know, I don't think it's going to have much effect on that, because it's a case context more or less. But I think that any young scholar out there now needs to think hard about how their work and their methodology and their theoretical orientation pertains to COVID, and to be prepared to have thoughts on COVID and the knock-on effects, which we're going to continue to see for a long time. Even if COVID gets resolved, we're still going to be talking about it in academia for many years. We will still be learning things about how we made policy decisions for years and years. It is both a tragic but also a good opportunity to look at kind of a sort of a treatment effect on public policy, or some type of big event that forces us to rethink the way we're doing public policy. So have a stance on it and be comfortable discussing it and writing about it. That would be my recommendation.
Thanks, Kris. I think that's an excellent answer. I'm going to move to the next question because we have quite a few questions in the chat window. And this is again to the panel. Anyone can please feel free to jump in to answer the question. So Hao Wang asks, would you have any techniques to help people find appropriate conferences to present their papers? Any techniques you could suggest to help find appropriate conferences to present your papers?
Well, I guess one way is to have a look at who else is presenting in this conference, and in the past years, who have been participating in these conferences. Are these scholars somewhat related to the work that you do? Are you able to contribute to the work of these scholars in any way at all? So for me, it's all about who else has been involved in these conferences, and if these are things that I'm familiar with, that I feel confident speaking about, that's typically where I would pitch to.
I think if I may just add to that, another way would be to just, there are a lot of newsletters which inform you about conferences. So be subscribed to those newsletters. And once you hear about a conference again, then use the filter of seeing who else has been presenting or has presented in the past, and use that to filter through which conference might be appropriate. Sorry, Masaru, yes.
Yeah, well, no, just following up. Probably if you're interested in some papers, and then if the authors of these papers are somehow going to attend a particular conference, then it would be a good opportunity to get to know that person. And then probably you can talk with that person during coffee break or dinner. So then I think that's one way of picking up conferences. And also you get to know the people in that field. So it's particularly if you have students, then there's nothing to lose in the sense that you can just try to approach them. So yeah, that's I think really good opportunity. Yeah, because of this COVID-19, then now it's not really easy. But then I hope that the physical conferences will come back soon. And then I think it's very important, particularly when you're graduate students, and then to get to know people.
Thanks, Masaru.
I also think there's some discussion about, are larger conferences better, smaller conferences? Larger conferences expose you to a broader variety of people. Smaller conferences help you make closer connections, et cetera. And I would say larger conferences are just a bunch of small conferences put together. And when you go into a conference, to be aware again of the social structure, the network structure of the subfield that you're working with. I remember going into the IPSA, International Political Science Association conference in 2014, I think that was in Montreal. It had like 3,000 people. And I went in, I had put my paper into a panel that I thought was sort of aligned with my paper, but I didn't really know the people in the panel. And I went and I presented, and they were polite and had some interesting questions, but it just didn't really go kind of anywhere else from there. And then I thought, well, I'm at this massive conference, and I've got a couple friends running around, and I'll just have a beer with them and then leave. And I thought, well, I could have gotten a lot more out of this. And I think that you need to be strategic going in, even in the big conferences. ICPP, this should be one on everybody's minds, right? And it's one that, we're hopefully going to have in person or hybrid in Barcelona coming up in June or July. I think it's July maybe. Although they might actually go all online as IPSA has done this year. But that is a place where I think it's just almost indispensable. And I don't speak on behalf of any sort of personal interest. I'm not I'm not an organizer of the conference or anything, but everybody's there. It involves everybody in our field. So you need to be where those conversations are happening. But even more than that, it's becoming larger and larger every iteration. I think we're in the 5th iteration now. I've been to every one of them, and it's been a case where clearly in that big of an environment, you're going to see fragmentation in the crowds, and you're going to see people sort of selecting into their own group of people. So be aware, even look at the conference, who are the panelists, who are the other people presenting, do a little background research on what institutions they're at, who have they co-authored with, what are they talking about recently, and then just worm your way into that. Try to stop people after the session and chat with them and talk with them, et cetera. Make the most of your conference. I used to think of a conference as something I'd put on my CV. Oh, good, I went to this conference. That's great. It looks like he's involved. I didn't understand that that's just, putting that line item on your CV is about the 10th most important thing that you're going to get out of a conference. And in other fields, aside from ours, other fields, conferences are places where job interviews are done. The MLA conference, Modern Language Association conference in the United States, almost all interviews for academic positions are held at the conference. So that's to underscore also that there may be, for people on the job market, opportunities to have discussions, identify who might be there from institutions where you're trying to get hired, catch up with them as well. Just squeeze every bit of value out of it. We all know it's expensive to go, especially when you're a PhD student. You go there and it's not a chance to hang out in Barcelona and have a bunch of beers. Treat it like a 12-hour-a-day job, and you'll come away with it probably with something quite valuable.
And if I may take that opportunity to just put a plug in about the AP-PPN conference, which is happening tomorrow and day after, and which features plenary sessions with invited speakers from universities in Hong Kong and outside in the morning. And in the afternoons, we have panel sessions, and I've posted the link for that in the chat window. So please do use this opportunity to attend these sessions. It's free of cost. And you will also, this would, I guess, fall in a mid-range conference because there will be tremendous opportunities to interact with the other panelists and others who are working on similar topics as yours or things that you're interested in. So do join us. And with that little plug-in about the conference, I move on to the next question. Thanks so much, Kris, for your answer. And this is Dana, who's asking, we have Kiji's question, who asks, could any one of you describe a typical writing day?
It depends on your circumstances. So as a PhD student, I was single, not married, no children. So I was writing all the time. If I was not eating or sleeping, I was writing. And now I'm married, I have a kid. So I write in the middle of the night, I write early in the morning, before and after he goes to bed. So it depends. And I try to snatch half an hour in the day in between my administrative roles, in between my other research roles to squeeze in writing here and there. So it really depends.
Thanks, JJ.
I don't think I have a block, like blocks of time, half day or whole day dedicated to writing. This hasn't happened to me for a long time. Just like JJ, I have kids and then the teaching job and loads of meetings spreading through the day. So you rarely get 3 hours of time, which is uninterrupted. So what I do is I tend to just use half an hour, 1 hour here and there, just to spend the time to write. And I think sometimes being busy is not necessarily a bad thing. It's actually make you more productive. You know that every minute that you've got spare time when kids is at school is very precious. So you have to really take advantage of every minute of your spare time. And then I think when I write, this is a habit even when I was doing my PhD. I don't really browse the social medias. I don't use Facebook or Instagram or whatever it is. I don't look at those gossip news when I'm writing or when I write codes and do analysis. This is just my writing time. And I think it's very important. Sometimes I see people sitting there, spend a whole day in the office, but most of the time they're doing something completely irrelevant. And then you need to really understand that time is really limited, especially if you become a permanent staff in an academic institution. You have loads of other tasks. The writing time is really limited. So make the most of use of your time, and concentrate on your writing is really important, I would say.
Thank you so much, Wei. I'm going to jump to the next question, which is from Dana. And Dana asks, how do we balance quality and quantity of the publications? For instance, some scholars may prioritize the quantity of publications rather than its quality.
This, I think, is a very tough question and depends on the institution you're working with as well. What is their requirements? for promotion and for tenure, so on and so forth. For me, I think quality is perhaps more important than quantity. And even if, if you judge other people's work, you always see if that person has published in the top journals in the field or not, rather than how many papers you have published. But for young researchers, probably it's a different thing. You probably want to have a few publications out first, just to get a feel about how to publish a paper, the whole process of publishing. But as you become senior and senior, you want to publish in a best journal in your field to establish yourself. And but sometimes when you're involved in a project, which you have maybe 10 or quite a lot of collaborators, you can't really control how the project goes. Yeah, so I would say I would still have those people who I am the first author or the corresponding author. I would really want them to be in the best journal I can publish. But sometimes if you're involved in really big projects, people have different ideas and different requirements for publications, and institutions may want them to publish as many as possible. And I'm not the leading author of that paper. Then I would say, having a publication is always better than no publication at all. So I will still have other papers which I have lots of collaborators, maybe not in the best journal, but the papers that I'm leading, I'll make sure that they go to the journal that I think would be, in the top tier of the field. Yeah.
So Panchali, in fact, has a related question, which was, how do you decide which journal to send the paper to? And I guess in your case, the papers that you're the lead author on, you prefer to send them to higher ranked journals, but would any of the other panelists have any thoughts they'd like to share on how they decide which journal to send the paper to?
Well, aside from the ranking, there is also a matter of the theoretical slant of the paper, the methodological bias or preferences of certain journals. So you should do it for yourself early in your career, a review of all the different journals in your field, and to look at what kinds of papers they publish, who's on the editorial board, what kind of research do they do, what kind of research do you think they like. So certain journals like Policy Studies Journal, they like Advocacy Coalition, Policy Networks, what have you. And you know that if you're not working on those areas, it's not a journal that you want to waste too much time on. Whereas another journal that is somewhat related to your methodology, you may want to do that. So that is one way, looking at the preferences of the journal to save some time. Certainly the ranking would help a lot at looking at which tier it's in. That's a more pragmatic aspect to it.
Yeah, I would also say being strategic. So journal articles forever. When you publish it, it's going to be online. It's not going away. People are going to know, 50 years from now, they're going to see evidence of that work. And you end up, if you've played it right, beginning to position yourself within, again, a particular scholarly community. Now, this gets back a little bit to what Professor Wei-Yang said about the institutional setting in which you're operating and what their expectations of you are. Not only is it a matter of whether they're telling you to do quantity over quality or vice versa, but also it's the group of scholars and people who are going to review your tenure dossier or the portfolio of work that you've done over some period of time, and they may want to see some type of cohesion in terms of you're consistently publishing in journals in this particular subfield versus you've dabbled in all of these different things, and one of the challenges with that is not only that spreading yourself across a lot of different subfields, while fun and while certainly personally educational, may not necessarily be a good strategy, is because aside from not necessarily allowing you to establish huge depth in any single subfield, also the reviewers that are going to look at your tenure dossier may not be familiar with these other types of journals. So, you would have a person looking and say, well, okay, I see you published in so Annals of the American Association of Geographers. Okay, I've never published there. I don't know what they're about. They're going to have to take extra effort to look into that journal and see, well, how good is it? Where does it rank? What are the kind of debates that are being had in that journal? In response, one thing I've done on my CV, if I'm on the job market, is out beside the journals, I'll place in parentheses, an impact factor and maybe a Q ranking, right? Q1, Q2, or whatever, because there are going to be people that look at your CV who, in my case, since I've done a few different journals in different subfields, and no single person is going to know all those journals, or they may have heard of them, but they're not going to be deeply familiar with each one of them. So you got to help them to try to understand that place where you published, whether it's geography or environmental studies or energy studies, is actually really good journal in that subfield. Otherwise, it's not going to mean much to them. So that gets back finally to even just sort of broader discussion about breadth versus depth, whether you should be drill deep and narrow, or you should be kind of a studied dilettante that covers a broad range of areas. And I think generally, depth is probably going to be favored over breadth in the long run. But at the same time, I have tried to resist that simply because I feel like I am energized by learning about different fields and different literatures and trying to bring them together. And as Scott Valentine, whom some of you will know, once told me, he said, don't apologize for that. Just keep doing it. Keep doing it and being who you are, and things will shake out.
Thanks so much, Kris. In fact, Earl, one of the participants, had a question, and I think this is really, really relevant for young researchers, that how can we identify if a conference or journal is predatory?
Beale's list. Well, it doesn't exist anymore, but sometimes I have looked on a Beale's list, and BEALL. It was discontinued, I think, in 2015, 2016. And some journals felt they were unfairly listed on Beale's list, and they appealed for their own removal. The methodology for inclusion of Beale's list wasn't necessarily as transparent as some people wanted it to be. But I think in general, the things like author publication charges and fees can be a bit of a warning sign, although it's not uniformly a good way to judge. But it's something I think that is common to all predatory journals, are sort of almost like punitive levels of publication fees. There are some, though, that do have publication fees that are quite good. So I wouldn't paint all of them that broad brush. So again, every predatory journal will have a publication fee, but every journal with a publication fee is not necessarily a predatory one. So you can see where I'm going with that. And as far as predatory conferences, I used to have this conversation with my cohort in Lee Kuan Yew School. We'd see, oh, well, there's a conference in Kota Kinabalu, there's a conference in Phuket, there's a conference in this and that. And oh, wouldn't it be cool just to go hang out on the beach? And like, well, if you're telling yourself you want to go to the conference because it's in a cool place or it's a nice vacation, it's probably not, the kind of conference you may want to waste your time on, unless you can get your institution to pay for your nice trip there, which is probably not going to happen. So again, I think that, the ones on the periphery are going to be the ones that you might not have heard about. Again, if you don't know the lay of the land, just send a quick email to your advisor or somebody in the department. Say, what do you think about this one? I've seen Mike Hallett do this once. I once asked Mike Hallett, well, what about this conference? And I watched how he evaluated it. And he said, well, let's go online and look at who's organizing it. So he went online, he looked at the organizers, he looked at their names and their affiliations and everything. And that was how he judged whether it was a kind of a legitimate. So that's a good way. Any conference website plus any journal is going to have a list of people affiliated who have sponsored it or are involved with it in some way. And, and just see if those are people that you recognize, any names that you recognize are people in the field.
Thanks, Kris.
Yeah, well, yes, just following what Kris said. Somehow I think these questions are related in the sense that I think it's important to identify the community you're interested in a way. So conferences, journals, and also the peer researchers, So somehow then you can see what should be the target based upon your interest and also your future career path. Then you can see which journals and which conferences you should attend by looking at organizers and also participants, keynote speakers, invited speakers. Then you can see which one will be important. So that's probably basically the way you can think about which one to go. And also, yeah, Kris also mentioned about the tenure the committee, and normally you ask external reviewers for your tenure assessment, and then normally you ask relatively well-known scholars in that area. So then obviously you need to be visible to these people in that area. So I think in that sense, it's good to try to focus on some key journals in the community, which people in that area pay attention to. Then normally you need to be recognized in that community to get tenure, as far as I understand. So yeah, in that way, probably you need to be strategic in the sense that you have some target journals, conference, the community, and then you try to show your presence there. You make presentations, you publish papers, and then people get to know you, and then you will be asked to review papers, and then you might be invited to join the editorial board of a journal. That's, I think, one way of showing your presence, recognition in that domain. So then you can somehow, and then you may get invitation to make a keynote speech, and then you may get kind of promoted to the president of the association or in the future. So yeah, well, in a way that I'm also learning all the time the how things work. So it's not very easy to see that at the early stage, but I think as far as I understand, that's the way that things work here.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Masaru, for sharing that. We will just do two last questions and then we will wrap up this session. So the second last question that we have is from Shubham, and Shubham asks, how can we self-review an article so that we know if the article is submission ready? Any tips on that, JJ?
Well, personally, I think it will always be hard to self-review an article. It's hard to set aside your lens of somebody who worked on this, put my blood and sweat and tears into this, and try to be objective and critical. So typically I don't do that. I send it to a friend, a colleague, somebody who would be willing to take some time to look at it and give me some really brutal comments. So I'm not sure how I could self-review an article. So yeah.
I see.
Perhaps I can add something. Usually when I send the article out for journal submission, I will make sure there's not a single word I can change for that manuscript. So if there's anything I can change, I wouldn't send it out. After you finish writing an article, a paper, you sort of have a feeling, if there's any methodological weakness or limitations in the article, if there's somewhere that you can improve. So if in your mind there's somewhere that you can improve, even the language or formatting of the table, or the graphs, is even slight change that I can make the paper looks better, I will do that before I submit. So I think this is probably what I think I would do. So for self-reviewing paper, I think it's very important. These are sort of some of the questions you need to ask long before you start writing the paper, like whether your research question is innovative enough, whether the research question is well articulated, whether the methods can answer the research question, your results are rigorous enough or not. Yeah, so I think after complete the whole manuscript, it's really the limited thing that you can do at that stage. But yes, I would say self-reviewing is very difficult, but at least before you decide to submit to a journal, make sure that you have done all you can, you have given 100% to the paper, so that it can go to a journal that you would like it to go. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Wei. And then we just have this one last question, which is from Emily. And Emily asked that, how do you decide authorship order when you write a paper together with colleagues? And if ever you experienced any authorship issues, I would appreciate if you could share what the problem was, or the discussion around it was, and how you solved the issue. So I think for me personally, when I've been involved in collaborative research projects, right at the onset, even before the project began, my collaborator and I would lay out what were the expectations that we had, and how we would expect authorship to be. And that prevented any future issues from arising. But I don't know if the panelists follow a similar approach or they adopt a different approach.
From my experience, especially if you are a junior researcher, PhD student, sometimes if you agree something in advance, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will happen in a later stage. If you feel there is a dispute in terms of the contribution authorship, one thing you could do, and I always encourage my students to do that as well, just to check, all the journal has the author guidance, like author contribution guidance. If you have some issues or dispute regarding the authorship, just to check if if the person who want to claim the first authorship has actually satisfied all the criteria. Yeah, if he has made major contribution in terms of conceptualizing the paper or analyzing the data, and then so on and so forth. I think there's very clear guidance from almost all the journal, at least on health policy and health economics, in terms of author contribution. You can actually look at this guidance to decide whether the person is deemed as appropriate for listed as an author. As the rule of thumb, I think usually the person who wrote the first draft usually will be the first author. And in Asia, in particular, people are quite sort of care about a corresponding authorship as well. So it's sometimes your supervisor or the person who guides through the whole process. And you might have a list of other authors as a co-author, which they may contribute methodologically or empirically, or to some part of the paper. But usually I think the first author should, the one who wrote the first draft usually should be the first author. And I think I make it really clear for my students, and never be shy to ask for the authorship if you think you have made the major contribution to the paper.
Thank you, Wei. Will any of the other panelists have anything to add to that? No.
I mean, I would say very briefly, sometimes the issues are resolved before they even come up if you are working with people you trust. And so this is where carefully selecting who you work with means something. But no, I agree with everything that Professor Wei Yang said. There are proper protocols for how to handle this or bring these complaints. There should be no predatory dynamics between senior and junior level editors, or excuse me, authors ever. And I hope that the Academy is paying attention to this, the toxicity of these power dynamics, and being aware of the fact that indeed there are cases where younger authors are taken advantage of, and it's just a sad reality. And the best we can do is just to bring it up, make it known, and hopefully the institutions that are set up to work it out actually function as they should.
Yeah. And also use platforms such as these to tell the new generation of early career researchers that we should be ethical in how we accord authorship, and yeah, and so that there is an end to the culture of toxicity if and when in the pockets that it exists. Yeah. Thank you all so much. We've had a really productive discussion for almost 1 hour, 55 minutes, and we had over 100 participants join us. Before we log out, can we take a group picture? Can I request everyone who's in the session to turn on their video cameras if they don't mind, and we'll take a couple of screenshots. And please do join us for the conference tomorrow and day after the plenary sessions. And Johnny, can I ask you to take a picture for everyone who's here?
Okay.
Okay, so Johnny's going to give a countdown, and he'll do 3, 2, 1, and I think he'll go through the screens a couple of times. Yeah, so keep your smile pasted on for maybe a little more than longer than 10 seconds.
Okay. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Okay, thank you.
All right. And thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you all panelists. Thank you, JJ. Thank you, Wee. Thank you, Masaru. Thank you, Kris. Thank you so much for your time. And please do join us for the conference tomorrow and day after. And yeah, we hope all of you took back something of value. Thank you so much.
Stuti.
Thank you, Stuti.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.